Welcome to Bringing Back the Wild. In each episode, Mike Arnold explores how science, tradition, and hands-on conservation come together to protect the wild places and wildlife we care about. Your host, Mike Arnold, is a professor of genetics, a lifelong hunter, and a conservation biologist. On this podcast, Mike dives into the science and stories behind bringing wildlife species back and keeping wild places wild. Sponsors of Bringing Back the Wild are Dallas Safari Club, conserving wildlife, engaging the public, and ensuring the future. Lifeform Taxidermy, guardian of the hunter's dreams. Zambezi Delta Safaris, protecting wildlife, empowering communities, and defining adventure. Royal Outfitters UK, tradition in the field and excellence in the hunt. Choctaw Hunting Lodge, native land, exceptional wildlife, unforgettable hunts. Now here's your host, Mike Arnold.
Well, we are at Safari Club International Convention in Nashville, Tennessee, and we're with Marc Newton, who is with Rigby, and we have tried twice for this, and this is wonderful. Thank you so much for meeting with us,
No,
Marc.
it's a pleasure. Thank you so very much for having me on and for taking the time, and apologies for trying to juggle all of these balls in the air at these shows. It's so busy.
You and I are both doing the exact same thing. Marc, I would love our folks to hear, how did you get into shooting and hunting? What did that look like for you growing up?
So I've said this before on our own podcast, but we have my brother and I and sister, a very Edwardian father. And what I mean by that is he was never the kind of man who would take us to the beach or the circus or the fairground or whatever it was. But what we did do with him was shoot, hunt, and fish. And my earliest memories as a 3-year-old were out, following him around in the woods, hunting deer. He was big into his deer stalking. So that's how we bonded and spent time with him. And all of the highlights of my childhood, I think about my brother and my sister and I out there and, shooting rabbits or shooting our first deer or first pheasant or whatever it might be. So it's been very much part of the family ethos, in the Newton tribe.
Did you grow up on property then out in the country, or did you go to hunting lands like we do in the U.S.? We had a deer lease.
So in the UK, we don't have public hunting land the way you do here in the US. It's all majority privately owned. Farther in the sort of the 60s and 70s, deer stalking was not as popular as it is now. It's really stepping back. I think after the Second World War, a lot of the British soldiers were coming back and they were seeing in Germany how they were hunting deer from high seats and with rifles and those things. So, it started to build a bit of a head of steam. And Dad in the 60s and 70s, he had a shed in the garden where we lived in the countryside, and he had deer heads on there, and he would have people coming and knocking on the door saying, "Are you the deer man? Can you come and shoot my deer?" So he had a huge piece of ground, with various different landowners who would ask him to come and shoot the deer. And that's how we got into it. And we'd go out with him Saturday, Sunday mornings, and he's shooting roe deer and fallow deer, and just amazing.
And what was your first big game animal, and when did you get that?
So I shot my first big game animal when I was 6.5 years old, believe it or not, with a 22-250 with my father. And it was a young roebuck that had been beaten up through the rut. And he had one antler that was broken. The part of the skull had broken and was hanging over his face. And I could take you to the exact spot in Sussex where we shot that. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. And we crawled up, and it was across a little valley. It was 100 yards, and we had a bipod, and Dad put the rifle in front of me and he helped hold it and tucked me in there, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I made the shot, and I thought I was a hero. And I've got a picture because my older brother shot a deer that morning as well, not his first, but the two of us sat there as little boys holding our roebucks, and very, very precious.
Well, and so do you still enjoy hunting deer in the UK, in England? Is that...
growing up doing it, my brother and I especially were fanatical about going out there and doing it, particularly through my 20s. And when we were growing up, so we were then hunting together and doing a bit of hunting with Dad and things. But for me now, approaching 40, it's about my own children. And, I've got Rose and Heather, they're 8 and 4. They call me Daddy Man. That's my name in the family, Daddy Man. And they love Daddy Man time which is either hunting, shooting, fishing, or surfing and camping or spearfishing, whatever it is. We're a very outdoorsy family, but I love to be out in the woods with them. And I'm getting big pressure from my eldest, Rose. She's, as I say, she's 8, and she says to me, "Daddy, when can I shoot my first deer? Because you were only 6.5 when you shot your first deer." And she shot a few pigeons with her pellet gun in the garden and stuff. But I've taken a different view because I think, hunting is, and I've talked about this on other podcasts, it's a deeply spiritual human experience. And for me, I got some wonderful advice from a South African friend. And I said to Rose, I said, "I'll tell you what, you can hunt your first deer." She comes out with me, but you can shoot your first deer when you're old enough to carry the rifle, when you're big enough to carry the rifle. And that could be next year, it could be whenever that is. So that's the deal that we have. So she's very keen, but they love to be out. I love to be out with them and teaching them. And it is something so fundamentally human about being out in the, green spaces, out in the woods, harvesting wild animals, taking them back. And again, with my children, we're not a religious family, but we'll say a kind of prayer when we get it. We always give thanks to the deer, and it's the things that perhaps I might think were missing in my own childhood. It was a much more rough and tumble, boys out there, let's go get another one. Whereas with the girls, my little girls, it's about giving thanks to the deer. Then we take it back. They learn how to process, to skin the carcass, break it down, making burgers, and then sharing it. And I think there's something, again, very fundamentally human about sharing wild harvest. You give someone a haunch of venison who perhaps doesn't hunt, and it's like you've given them a piece of gold. And I want my children to see me doing that, and they're part of that. And so it's a big family thing.
I think I'm so encouraged to hear how you're approaching this. I don't have very many animals that I take that I don't have tears in my eyes when I'm with the animal. Because it is a life sacrifice. Yes, I take it home, we process it, we utilize all the meat, we give the meat away, to friends who don't hunt, who love it. But there is a life taken. And I think we need to understand that I think it is a spiritual thing. I really do. And I love that part of it. I think it doesn't make me not want to hunt, but it does make me want to respect those times and treasure those times.
Yes. Yeah, no, very much. And, in the UK, my favorite thing to hunt is a roe deer. And I think that probably comes from the fact that is our father's passion. He loves hunting roe deer. And every roe deer you hunt is different. You'll never shoot two that look the same. And they're such characters. And they're one of very few deer that I can think of that grow their antlers in the winter. So you hunt them in the summer. And an English summer's day where you get up at 3:45 just to get there before first light, and you can have an amazing experience out in the fields and the woods and roe deer chasing each other in the roughs, and you get back home by 8 a.m, and it's like you've been given this gift that you've had this whole piece of the day that 99.99% of people won't have experienced because they're got the common sense to still be in bed at that time in the morning. But it's so special, and I think it's very grounding, and it's something that I feel very passionate about sharing with my children and passing it forwards, but passing it forwards in the right way. I would like them to, one day with their children, to be able to pass it forward. And it's about that respect and all of the things we stand for at Rigby's, hunting, underpinning and supporting conservation. We are part of nature. We are not separate from it. And, human beings hunting for the right reasons, for the ethical reasons, is part of the great circle of life, I suppose.
So you mentioned Rigby, and obviously the folks know you're from Rigby. How did you become connected with this wonderful company?
It's a long story, Mike.
And that's okay, because we have a long time to listen to a fascinating story. You tell us whatever you want.
So I'll try and condense it. So as I said before, we grew up hunting, shooting, fishing. It was all I could think about as a teenager. And I used to fly fish a lot. I still fly fish, but again, particularly with the kids. But I used to go to Orvis in our local town, and I'd buy fishing flies when I was 16 years old. One day, the lady who managed the shop, she came to me and she said, you seem like a very nice young man. We see you in here occasionally. Would you be interested in becoming our Saturday boy? And I said, oh, God, this sounds great. So I was at college at the time, which in the UK is 16, 17, 18. Upper part of high school, not university. And on Saturdays, I would go and work at Orvis, and it's incidentally where I met my wife when we were 18 as well. We've been together 20 years this year. Working for Orvis, I was finishing college, and Nina said, the manager of the store said, what is your plans for the future? And I said, don't really have any plans. I wasn't planning to go to university, didn't know what to do. Should I take a gap year and go and travel? And she said, well, the London Orvis store is looking for someone to train up as a bit of a salesperson in the fishing department. So I thought, great. I think I've been to London once in my whole life, a country bumpkin living in Sussex. So 3 weeks later, I found myself on a train with a suitcase and moved up there. And it was quite the baptism of fire, I can tell you, moving to a big city. And what I would do at lunchtime, because I didn't know anybody in London, at lunchtimes I would leave the Orvis store on Dover Street and I'd walk around the West End gun room. So Holland and Holland, Purdy, Beretta Gallery, William Evans. I mean, amazing. And I'd be in there and I would look at the guns and dream about the guns and talk to the people that worked there. And I ended up befriending a man called Michael Cartledge, who we ended up being roommates a few years after. But I'd go in and have lunch with him at Beretta Gallery almost every day. And we'd sit there and we'd talk about Tickers and Seikos and Berettas and Rigbys and all kinds of amazing stuff that they had there. I suppose it was about a year or so into being in London. He said, have you heard of Paul Roberts from Rigby? And I said, of course I've heard of Rigby's, but I don't know who Paul Roberts is. And he said, well, he used to own it. And he's got this company called J. Roberts and Son, and they're just south of the river here in London. And I used to work there, Michael said. And he said, but Paul Roberts is looking for a young lad to train up. Would you go and meet him? I thought, great. I mean, Orvis is pretty good, but I'm spending most of the time selling women's blouses and clothing and the odd fishing rod. So this hunting thing sounds pretty good. So I went down to meet Paul, and it was amazing. It was amazing. This old shop built post-war that you couldn't tell it was a gun shop from the outside. I bought a suit from Asda for £30 that morning. So I got a suit on which it didn't fit and long since got rid of it, thanks. But turned up in this suit, and David Marks, who was Paul Roberts' partner in the business, elderly chap, tragically passed away a few years ago, and not before we got Rigby's back, because I'd love to have shown David that Rigby was back in London. But anyway, David opens the door, takes me into the office, and he said, can I get you a drink? And I said, yes, please. He said, well, we've got some soup. It was Thai green chicken soup. I remember thinking, this is such a bizarre place. And so he gives me this big mug of soup, and I'm sort of sat there like there's like piles of ivory and a rhino shoulder mount and pictures of Paul Roberts with trendy hats and big moustaches in the 1960s, hunting in these amazing places I'd never heard of at that point, and the smell of Rangoon oil and old gun cases. And it was an Aladdin's cave of wonders. And eventually Paul Roberts comes in, and he's wearing a green Kynoch lab coat. He's been in the workshop, and my job interview went like this. Paul comes over, I stand up and said, Mr. Roberts, it's a pleasure to meet you. He shook my hand, he looked me up and down, and he said, I think you'll do. And that was it. That was it. I was in. And he showed me around. We spent about 45 minutes looking around the business. And again, one of my favorite parts of it is it's just amazing, looking at 600 Nitro Express double rifles that were being made. And it's just incredible. I couldn't believe I was there. And Paul said to me, he said, well, part of your job, he said, have you got a driving license? And I said, no. And Paul paid for my driving lessons so I could get my driving license. He said, because you're going to need to be able to drive to the range, because part of your job will be testing all of the guns that we make and we repair. This is amazing. I'm going to be paid to drive Paul's car to the range and shoot double rifles. This is stuff of dreams. And so Paul said, what's the biggest rifle that you fired? So I puffed my chest up and said, well, Dad's got a 30-06. And he shook his head. He said, we don't make anything that small. So I was rather put into my place pretty quickly with that. And but it was absolutely amazing. Paul would turn up normally sort of late mornings. He'd drive in from Sussex, and it wasn't a job. It was a holiday camp. You get to spend all day with this guy. And not just Paul, there was David Marks, who I mentioned before, John Restaghini. I mean, between those three guys, they had 150 years of experience in the industry, legends of the British gun trade. And then, of course, Patty Pugh, who was Paul's former partner and financial director and had owned Rigby's with Paul. And she really took me under her wing in the company as well. And I'd stay there until sort of 8, 9 o'clock at night sometimes, just listening to Paul's stories and learning from Patty. And it was amazing. And it was an apprenticeship, which I often feel sad that I can't give my own staff now at Rigby's, because as I said before, it's 150 years of gun trade experience, of safari experience, the variety of guns that we saw coming through there, from Brownings to Bosses to Rigby's to Jeffreys to Wesley Richards. Everything used to come through that. All the guns in storage, Jim Corbett's rifle in the storage cupboard there. I mean, just absolutely amazing. Fast forwarding, a few years, I worked my way up from essentially being the tea boy, sweeping the floors, following Paul around, helping Patty with the storage, to Patty convincing Paul to let me come out to Safari Club. I think I've been there a couple of years, coming out here and seeing, this amazing thing. And I've always remember being at my first Safari Club in Reno and running behind Paul, carrying his bag for him as he sort of walks in as this sort of rock star of the industry. And he said, "Oh, look, the heavies have arrived." And I said, "Who are the heavies, Paul?" And he said, "It's Holland and Holland." As all the Holland guys stood there in a line, they all had like matching waistcoats on. And I'm thinking, oh my God, it's Holland and Holland. And all these amazing, famous hunters I'd heard about at the show. And anyway, fast forwarding, but by the time I was sort of in my mid-20s, I was helping Paul run things in terms of the sale. I was doing a lot of the sales at the company, involved in running the factory with Paul, just really getting into the nitty gritty of gun making. And at the same time, Rigby had moved from California to Dallas. And we don't need to waste any time on this podcast talking about the Californian days of Rigby, because it was a dumpster fire of a period of our history. But the guys in Dallas, brilliant guys, they recognized that there were some big trademark issues globally with Rigby, so they sorted that out. But the most important thing they recognized is that Paul Roberts is, in my opinion, to this day, is still Mr. Rigby. So they re-partnered with Paul. They gave Paul a license to manufacture Rigbys again in London. There was a fake London Rigby set up in the meantime, which we got shut down. And Paul and I started making Rigbys under license for Rigby Dallas. And I would fly out here every few months and work through orders and come and help on the booth at the various shows, and Paul would be there. And I suppose it was January 2013, Safari Club. I was working and helping on the Rigby booth, the American Rigby booth. And a man called Michael Luca, who owns one of the owners of Blaser Group, came onto the booth, and I was introduced to him, and he said, could we talk? And I said, "Oh, certainly, Mr. Luca," or Michael, in fact. So, he's always been very friendly in that regard. And we walked off the booth, and he said, "Well, I've been shown a PowerPoint presentation about Rigbys." And he said, "I will probably be the man who's remembered for buying Rigbys in 30 minutes. But we're only going to do it if we can find someone to run it in London, because we feel that it should not be German. It's British. It must be back in London. And we want someone who can do this for us. And I've heard that you work for Paul Roberts, who used to own Rigbys with Patty Pugh in the 80s and the 90s. And, you young person, enthusiastic, but perhaps you could tell me in a few minutes here how you would relaunch Rigby in London." Now, I'd dreamt about this. I used to work for Paul and sit there and type his emails and dream about having Jeffrey and Rigby back in London, and a Wesley Richards style showroom with an apartment and all of those sorts of things. So I'd kind of thought it through anyway. But I essentially told him what we've since done. So we would partner with Mauser again. We'd work to relaunch the Rising Bike double rifle. That Rigby should be all about people and the stories and we don't need to reinvent the wheel with Rigbys. We just need to make proper Rigbys how John Rigby made them. And Michael listened, and he essentially turned to me and said, "I want you to start immediately, but we want you as a partner." So they made me a shareholder. And I remember saying to him, "But I can't afford any shares." And he said, No. We said, "We'll give you the shares because we want someone in London who doesn't have their feet up on the table reading the paper. We want a partner here who's going to drive this forwards." The truth of it is I would have probably done it all for free, because it was, to this day, I can't believe I get paid to do this job. And I came back to London. The hardest thing I think I've ever had to do was to talk to Paul. And again, I mentioned earlier that I'd often stay late in the evenings. I was there with him, and I said, "Paul, I've got to talk to you about something, and it's pretty serious." And he said, "Oh, right." And he was in a chair, and he put his hands behind his head listening to me. And I said to him, "Paul, I've been offered this amazing opportunity. They're going to sell Rigbys to the Blaser Group." He said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "They've asked me to come and be the managing director." And he went quiet, and he said, "You've got to do it," which was a huge thing, because Paul was moving out of London at the time, and I was due to go with him, and was going to help run the business down in Sussex. And we'd made a lot of efforts on that already. And not only was he supportive, he also negotiated with his cousin who owned the building that we were in for Rigby to take on the lease for a year to get the company going. So from the January meeting with Michael, within 8 weeks, we had a premises set up. Rigby's was up and going. But there was one more piece of the puzzle here that was so important. Was I spoke to my dad, around that time, and I said, "You'll never believe it. I've been offered this opportunity, but I have no idea how to run a business. I don't know what a P&L is, a balance sheet, none of this stuff." And he said, "Look, you can learn all of that." But he said, "You can't learn this opportunity." And he said, "You get so many cards in life." He said, "You need to take it." And I got some other great advice from a client who said, make sure you put good people around you. So the number one thing I did was to speak to Patty, who I'd mentioned earlier, who's just so unbelievably supportive. And if Paul is my surrogate father, then Patty would be my surrogate sort of mother, and it's sort of taken me under her wing. And I said, Patty, would you come out of retirement and, get this going? And she was amazing. And my co-director, and held my hand in those first few years and helped set the business up and helped find our new building. She was absolutely instrumental in doing all of that. And I continued to learn a huge amount from her. And I think after the first 2 or 3 years, she then set back, and I was on, the stabilizers came off the bike and off we went. But I've tried to condense a very complex, long story into 5-10 minutes for you.
No, that's gorgeous. So I'm a professor, right? That's been my day job for many, many, many years. I'm a conservation biologist. But as a professor, we think in terms of 3 and 5 year plans quite often in our research. As an analogy, do you have a 3 or 5 year plan?
We do have a 3 and a 5 year plan. And we're at an interesting point at the moment that the last 13 years has been one hell of a slog to get Rigby back to where it is. Last year, we celebrated our 250th anniversary, and it was amazing. And the only way I can describe it was 3 years of planning for that event. It felt like we had summited some sort of mountain and put the Rigby flag in. It was like, Rigby is back. We'd had other moments like that, the Jim Corbett, Nation Rival, other things along the way, but it was like, bang. And all of a sudden I realized, like, we're here. Like, the thing that I've been striving for and the team have been striving for, and all the formative years of Paul Roberts, like, we've arrived. And I don't feel all that different to how I felt at the beginning of this. And it's sort of, oh my God, what's next? And I suppose in the short term, the plan is to move into our new building, which is what we desperately need. We're in the same building we were in 12 years ago, which is woefully too small. We're working miracles on a postage stamp in there. We bought the former Russian Ballet School in Clapham, which is a spectacular building, and we are due to move there in probably 3 months.
What is the size of that?
So that's a little under 10,000 square feet, and it's beautiful, built in 1850, high ceilings, oak beams. It's got a sort of light industrial feel, but it's also it's a beautiful, beautiful grade 2 listed building. And our vision for it is to turn it, as we always have done at Rigby's, to make it feel like our home. So when customers, or anyone who's interested for that matter, wants to come to London, wants to visit us, that they feel like they're coming into our home, that it's a very warm and welcoming, non-corporate, non-retail environment. We want people to come and spend time there, to feel part of something. I've said this so many times, that Rigby is not a bronze ornament on a shelf somewhere. What it is Rigby. Rigby is a shared idea that people all around the world believe in. So it really is the people. And whether they're the people at the company, or they're the people who come and buy a baseball cap or 10 Rising Bites, they are Rigby. So this new headquarters is, I suppose, a place where those people can come together. We can share in that experience. Other than the new building, we've got some other products in the pipeline. A new over and under shotgun, which is a big step into the future for Rigby's. And I think, I'm very excited about that. And also our training academy, because the sad thing is, for the amazing reputation that the British gun trade has for making best guns, we have all been woefully poor in training young people. There's been 40, 50 years where there's not been enough young people trained. So our vision at Rigby is, working with the amazing Gunmakers Charitable Trust in London, is to have an academy where we've always got 5 or 10 people being trained within the company. There will be a certain number of those that won't make the cut, or people who leave. But the hope is that there'll be a handful of them each year that can supplement our workforce. We can then take this whole thing to the next level.
500,000 acres demand more than management. They demand responsibility. In Mozambique, Catata 11 stretches across 500,000 acres of floodplain, forest, and riverine habitat along the Zambezi River. This land doesn't forgive mistakes. It rewards discipline, patience, and commitment. At Zambezi Delta Safaris, hunting funds everything that keeps this ecosystem alive. Client dollars pay local salaries. They equip anti-poaching teams. They keep helicopters flying to monitor wildlife and intercept intruders who test the boundaries. Scientists live on the ground year-round, tracking populations and guiding decisions with data, not guesswork. This operation doesn't extract value from the land, it reinvests in it. Every season strengthens protection. Every hunt reinforces accountability. This is conservation that scales to the size of the wilderness it protects.
Never say no, but what we've tried to do at Rigby's is to cultivate an environment which is very accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And I use the term leveling. And what I mean by that is we have customers who range from a 10-year-old girl who comes in and we give her a baseball cap and she's like made up with this, I got a Rigby cap from the Rigby team, all the way through to leaders of countries or leaders of massive global corporations. It really doesn't matter who you are. Actually, I have a policy with my guys that my sales team are banned from looking anyone up before. So if they get a phone call or an email from someone who's coming in, they're not allowed to Google them. So we treat everyone at face value when they come in here. And we want to provide an environment where people can come and talk about hunting in and it's a very modern term, but safe space, with other people who are really passionate about it, where they can leave the sort of competitive trappings of modern corporate, capitalist life, or whatever you want to call it. That Rigby's a place of adventure. It's about sharing a campfire, and never say never with the with a shooting team or something. But we try and keep as much of competitiveness out of it. Now we do have our Duggar Boy award, but we were very, very keen to not make it a competition. Whilst there has to be someone who wins it, we wanted people to feel part of something. That people aren't competing with one another. We have enough of that sort of stuff in life.
Absolutely.
It's about, ultimately the Duggar Boy Award is about changing people's thought process, changing the culture that surrounds buffalo, that age should always be more important than inches. Yeah, I mean, again, that's just my personal sort of take on it and my personal spin on this Rigby thing, that it should be a place where people can leave all of that stuff behind. They can come and sit down with us in the showroom. They can talk about their buffalo hunt. We're genuinely interested to hear about it. We don't want to just talk about ourselves, and people leave feeling that they've gotten something from that.
So if your short term is moving into your new space, what is the bit longer term?
I'll spill the secrets. My long-term vision, and everyone thinks I'm nuts for saying this, or a lot of people think I am, but I've always seen myself as a bit of a Willy Wonka character. That was my favorite movie growing up. And what I mean by that is I've always been a big blue sky thinker. Some of those ideas are complete trash, but some of them turned out to be quite good. The 250th, for example, relaunching the Rising Bike, the other things that the team and I have done along the way. I'm surrounded by at Rigby's very good people. Monty, my very dear friend here, who's our ops director, he's there very organized, tucked in next to me to make sure that those big ideas are implemented, which is not so much my strong point. I'm more of the blue sky sort of stuff. But people think I'm mad, but I truly believe that the future of the British gun trade lies within part of it, not all of it, but part of it falling under one ownership structure. What I would love to do is to be able to take the success from Rigby's and more importantly, take the amazing people that have made it successful. Some of them joined us at 18-year-olds who are now in their early 30s, who are amazingly experienced and talented, to start buying other gun-making names that perhaps that they haven't had the investment that Rigby's has had from Blaser Group in Germany and that sort of level of support. Blend that with our experience, blend it with the manufacturing capabilities that we have with this amazing machine park, and build something of a UK gun-making group. And at the center of that for me would be a shared training academy, where one academy then is, perhaps it could end up with 5 companies in this group, where they all pull resources into one academy, and then the best students and graduates from that academy then go into those companies. Now, people say, well, this is madness. The gun trade's never done something like this. But if you look at watches and other, particularly luxury good industries, they have found longevity and a renaissance in their brands through collaboration and working together. Yeah, that I suppose my big 10-year vision would be to be sat here with you and have 2 or 3 other brands in a UK gun-making group, and whilst they all have their own identity, their own management structures, and they're separate, behind the scenes, there's a lot of shared resources and working together.
And let's face it, that's really exactly what Blaser did for Rigby.
Correct.
And so to have a reinvigoration of other brands could only be good.
I totally agree.
And I don't think it sounds mad at all. Now, I'm a very much a person who has, throughout my career, synthesized, in other words, drawn things together, things that look disparate. So I love your blue sky analogy. They need visionaries like you who are looking down the line and saying, 10 years from now, let's see a renaissance of X, Y, and Z. And
Absolutely.
then nobody can lose from that sort of thing.
No, I agree. And in a strange place in my career, like that, I'm 39 this year. So I'm relatively young, but I've also got, by the end of this year, nearly 15 years CEO experience within the gun trade, and have overseen, with the amazing team, of course, this incredible resurgence of the Rigby brand. So there's this huge amount of experience within our company and how to do that. But when I look at the rest of the industry, people in my position are at least maybe 10 years older than I am, and perhaps haven't, some of the guys haven't the 15 years of experience behind it. So I feel sort of overqualified for the place that I am in my life. But I have to take on board and reflect, that I've got time on my side. I want to be doing this for the next 20, 30 years, particularly with the young team that I build around me. And they're all, as I am, chomping at the bit to make a difference on the industry, and to, whether that's through conservation projects that we're doing at Rigby's, or whether something like this big blue sky vision where we can bring other companies under one ownership structure, and to secure this amazing craft skill and amazing industry which dates back centuries in London.
Well, and I would encourage you that, once again, you're already doing this. Look back and say, wow, look where we are.
Yeah.
Look where we came from, and look where we are, because Rigby, I would just encourage you that all of us are out there cheering for you guys and saying this can only get better.
Well, that's very, very humbling. And if I'm perfectly radically honest, it's quite difficult to hear that. And that's what I talked about before with sort of, we summited this mountain and being on the sand. It's amazing. I remember turning up the first couple of years at this show, and I had borrowed guns, a tablecloth, and a crappy tent that we had at the time, saying, "Hi, I'm Marc Newton, and I'm going to relaunch Rigby's." And I'm sure there are a lot of people going, "Oh yeah, okay, good luck." But the one thing I had more than anything was two things. One, I had Patty with me, who brought a huge amount of stability to it. But also I could say I was trained by Paul Roberts and Patty Pugh. And that gave it credibility. But fast forwarding all these years now, we have so many people who come by the booth who are now saying, "Mr. Newton, please just call me Marc, no need for Mr. Newton." People saying, "What a great job you've done." And I find it quite uncomfortable. I don't know why, maybe it's my upbringing or something, because really I see it has been a huge team effort. I see my people, and I would die for my people at Rigby's, how hard they work. And all I've done is just been given this amazing opportunity. And all I've had to do is turn up, and yes, I've worked hard, but it's kind of just fallen into place. It was like it was written in the stars. And be under no illusion, that we as I say, when I sit there and reflect, I'm not sure how I feel about what we've done, in that I see Rigby's as 13 years ago, it was a coal from a fire. It was a sleeping giant. And all we've had to do is just give it a bit of love. We've not had to reinvent the wheel. There was so much stuff in the back catalogue of Rigby's history that we could just, the Rising Bite, we partner with Mauser, just keep it core to what Rigby's has always been. We just sort of blown on that little ember, and then whoosh, this big bushfire has now sort of erupted out of it. And as I say, people are still saying, "Mr. Newton, thank you so very much." I sort of think, man, I would be doing this for free. Inside, I'm like a 10-year-old schoolboy. I get paid to come and run Rigby's, hang out with amazing people in the industry. I remember as a teenager watching the Buzz Charlton elephant hunting DVD with my dad, being totally and utterly starstruck by this guy. And I said to my dad, "I'm going to hunt an elephant with him one day." And my dad is sort of, "Oh, you will you?" And I've done 2 or 3 big hunts with him now, and he's become a great friend, and we do lots and lots of things together. And I'm still that teenager sat here talking to you today. It's, and I think having that is hopefully what people feel from the brand. That when you come to the booth, that you're talking to real people who really care, and frankly, are just grateful to be here.
Well, and just to tell you, I feel so honored, because I grew up hearing about Rigby, quite a bit older than you. And so I grew up with Rigby echoing in my head, thinking, wow, I'd love to get to Africa. Look at all these people hunting with the Rigbys, reading Ruar. So for me to be sitting here with the CEO of Rigby is like I'm in a candy store.
No, that's
For
very
me.
sweet.
So thank you. Marc, I'm going to let you get back to your work, but thank you for spending the time with us
Absolute
today.
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, this has been so wonderful to hear about the development and once again, excited to see where Rigby ends up in 10 years from now.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
If this conversation meant something to you, please follow Bringing Back the Wild so you don't miss future episodes. Consider leaving a rating or sharing the podcast with someone who cares about wildlife and conservation. You can also visit MikeArnoldOutdoors.com for stories from the field, conservation-driven articles, and information about my books. I'm Mike Arnold. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.